This is Dr. Goodin with Abnormal Psychology Over Time. This is the first section of many. So we'll be starting out with, obviously, the introduction. Things I'd like you to think about as you start thinking about abnormal psychology. Do you feel compassion? Don't just answer that because there's the right answer, but think about, do you actually feel it? This is a big issue with abnormal psychology and something that sort of distinguishes normal from abnormal at times, is whether you're able to take the perspective of somebody else, and compassion is a good sign of that. You might also ask yourself, what is your personal definition of abnormal or psychological dysfunction? We'll start here with the first bullet. What does etiology mean? This basically just means, what is the cause? What is the cause? The more about the etiology we know, the more we can try to treat it appropriately, possibly find a solution for the disorder. With the disorder, a lot of mental disorders, there's no, well, it just depends, but there's often not a cure, but rather a treatment at this stage. Remember, psychology is a very young field. It's a young science, and so we know very little about what is actually going on with the brain, neurotransmitters, the parts of the brain. Let's move on to stigma. Stigma include attitudes towards those with mental health. This is a big deal. It's changed over time, and it's I think slowly improving, but it's still an issue. Going to see a psychiatrist or a therapist of some kind, you may be stigmatized. You may be stigmatized for saying you have depression. Definitely be stigmatized for saying you have schizophrenia or something like that. Comorbidity is just something that should be mentioned. Comorbidity really has to do with two psychological disorders occurring at the same time. So those who are depressed often also have anxiety issues. That would be an example of comorbidity. Before I move too far away from etiology, I want to note some other important terms: prevalence and incidence, that you may want to pay attention to as you're reading your textbook. Kind of looking at the history of mental illness, we see that in the early stages, a lot of people thought that mental illness had a lot to do with good or evil spirits playing a role. And so, if you were in front of me, we might have a discussion. You need to think about it. How many of you actually believe in the spiritual realm? And if so, perhaps you grew up in a Christian household or otherwise. It doesn't matter for this class. But depending on how you grew up, you may or may not believe in things like demon possession. Where historically, we might think that demon possession was the cause of some abnormal behavior. And I'm not here to tell you that that was never the case or is still not the case. My goal is not to teach you about whether demon possession does in fact occur or not. I've seen some pretty messed up stuff that I couldn't explain with psychology. That being said, my goal here is not to teach about spiritual things, but rather to talk about the science of psychology and what we do know based on it. Of course, we've come a long way from blaming every psychological problem on some sort of spiritual issue. Um, and there was some movement from, I mean, there's always been some focus on good and evil spirits, but Hippocrates said that mental disorders have natural causes. He talked about the four humors, that we all have different compositions, and that would lead to us having different dispositions. The philosopher Galen talked about mental and physical issues and changes in the nervous system. Of course, church oversight was a huge issue. So there was a lot of, at one point, this good and evil sort of thing. Even apart from possession, we got into some witch hunts to blame people for things, and the story with witches is quite interesting, because they actually used, if you take my drugs and behavior course, there are some bright spots to that course that are just like, wow, that happened, and they used psychoactive drugs, basically herbal remedies that and they used those and created effects that were like witches' spells and things like that. But definitely the church oversight of mental health, anything they didn't like, or if it was a mental disease, unfortunately, at some points in church's history, probably various churches, but I'm more thinking of Roman Catholic, and the derivatives of it, were often likely to say somebody was a witch or possessed. Scientific questioning began with Paracelsus, and Paracelsus actually, they all have some strange ideas. They were all just trying to figure things out and how things worked. And you may think it's stupid. This guy thought that he came up with the word lunatic, which comes from the word luna, which means moon. He thought the moon had a lot of effect on our mental health, sort of a psychic influence on us. Now you may think that sounds silly, but think about the people that we've also thought sounded silly through time. Galileo, for instance, comes to mind. Hypnosis became popular with Weyer, which is spelled W-E-Y-E-R. He was ahead of his time and considered the father of psychopathology. And then St. Vincent de Paul was one of the first to actually say that mental issues are no different than physical issues. That's still a fight today to get people to recognize that mental health, just because you can't see the broken or the imbalanced neuron pathway in your brain, doesn't mean it doesn't exist the same way you would see a broken bone sticking out of a man's leg. We need to start to see these things equally and realize that they do have physiological, biological, scientific issues at play, not just weakness, not just spiritual things. A person with depression has chemicals at play in their body that are affecting their mood significantly. We had some mental hospitals, but even before mental hospitals, we had asylums. And there were some famous names with these, sort of Panel, sort of started the humanitarian movement of kindness. Tuke was known for moral management, and Rush came along and had sort of the mental hygiene movement. But these were all rather myopic views. Myopic means sort of short-sighted, too focused, not thinking about the bigger picture. They were mainly just focusing on physical issues. Dorothea Dix talked about, she started the inhumane treatment campaign because mental hospitals were bad, asylums were bad. Um, Ward wrote a book on mental hospitals called The Snake Pit. Um, Eventually, the NIMH, or the National Institute of Mental Health, um, was created for research and training. The Hill-Burton Act basically developed community mental health facilities. It was the Community Health Services Act. And eventually what all these led to was, from institutionalizing everything, from big hospitals with lots of patients, as you've seen in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or maybe you watch season 2 of American Horror Story, whatever it is that you've watched where you've seen an old school asylum or mental hospital. Those began, the idea was great. Uh, like a lot of ideas are great. It didn't necessarily work, I'll tell you that now. But the idea was, we need to get these people, we need to not, they're not getting any better, just stuck out of a normal lifestyle, out of their normal environment in these hospitals, and we need to get them out into the community, possibly working if we can. And we'll spread out our hospitals from these centralized units in the middle of nowhere, perhaps, to community centers where they can come in when they need help and then return to their homes easily, and they'll sort of have outpatient care will be the main thing. So from out of hospital confinement, so we went from 500,000 hospitals to about 100,000 hospitals, and it was a great idea, but the community services, the community outpatient clinics, things like that, were not able to provide the level of expertise, the staffing, the equipment that the hospitals were able to provide. And so a lot of people got lost in the system, or I should say outside the system, because the system was less organized. And so they would not come in for their outpatient visit. A lot of the people that were deinstitutionalized from the state and federal hospitals ended up as our homeless population. And to this day, that continues. A lot of our homeless population does suffer from mental illness of some sort, more than the average population. Lots of schizophrenia on our street corners. And four themes of change are biological discovery, brain and mental disorder, secondly, classification system, thirdly, psychological causation views, and fourthly, experimental psychological research. Let me talk a bit about each of these. And by the way, normally, this chapter is short, but normally I'm going to encourage you all to, if this is your first time reading along with me or listening to me, please take notes. Please write down what's important to you. Normally the things I say should be important to you. Do that, take notes, but one thing that's really important is sort of getting into serial position effect, primacy and recency effect. You need starts and stops. You need to reset your brain. You're going to get tired and you're going to quit paying attention. We want to avoid that. So feel free, as I said, this chapter is pretty short, but normally feel free to take a break. In fact, maybe set a little timer for yourself. Take a break every 10 to 15 minutes. Go use the restroom, get a glass of water, rest your hand. Don't play a video game. That's addictive, unless it's a really short video game, maybe a quick Facebook game or something. But whatever you can do that just will reset, and you come back, you'll have your brain ready to learn a bit more. That being said, let's talk about biological discovery. One of the first things that was found out had to do with syphilis. Now, there was this thing going around called general paresis, and it was discovered that syphilis was causing it. What did they do? Well, at first, they would expose people to malaria, and the malaria fever would burn away the bacteria. And then penicillin came along, and of course, this was over a long period of time, but what really happened here is that, people were dying people with syphilis were dying of malaria. We would do post-mortem dissections of the brain and eventually found out, hey, malaria is killing off the syphilis and curing them of general paresis. So eventually what we started to find was there were organic bases of some mental disorders. Then we got into classification. Now we've come a long way from the first DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're now at the DSM-5. And those come out as needed. They're not always fully agreed upon, but they do give us some classification system for mental health disorders and abnormalities. Psychological causation was started with Freud and even Mesmer, I'd say. Freud was obviously into psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis. Mesmer, think of to be mesmerized by something. That word comes from his name. He believed in planets and the moon and things like that having magnetic forces that played a role in our psyche. He was also very interested in hypnosis. The Nancy School was also interested in hypnosis and dealing with hysteria. And they were the first to sort of say that to bring about the idea of self-hypnosis, that we could be self-hypnotized, maybe on purpose, maybe not. Charcot was known for degenerative brain changes leading to hysteria. He was proven wrong, but it was a big debate, and it was a good conversation to have to sort of get the ball rolling. And that's really what I attribute Freud for. He had some great ideas, and some of them were a little strange or very strange. But Freud was really one to get the ball rolling, to get conversation started, to get us where we are today, where psychology is not an issue that we don't talk about. Instead, it's something we do talk about, we learn about, we study it, we seek to help people and understand their problems so that we can alleviate those problems. Now, Freud talked about the idea of catharsis, which is emotional release, and he said we can have catharsis through hypnosis. And of course, he was really interested in the subconscious and the unconscious. He really said that we don't need hypnosis. Eventually, he quit emphasizing hypnosis as much because of the way he did therapy through free association techniques that would lead to catharsis without the need for hypnotizing. It also could get at what was going on. His idea was that hypnosis was able to tell us about the unconscious and the subconscious. But through free association and dream analysis, he was able to reach the subconscious urges and things that are repressed, and to help somebody get to a catharsis without actually using hypnosis. So, the fourth thing I want to mention is psychological research and objectives. William Wundt, it's William Wundt is how it's spelled, had the first psychological laboratory and established some experimental methodologies. Cattell was one of the first to study personality theory. Whitmer studied clinical psychology. Healy was well known for studying juvenile delinquency, especially having to do with urbanization and some influence of the environment. Of course, as psychological research increased, behaviorism became more popular because it was very scientific. It focused on direct, observable behaviors, and this led to, Pavlov and his theory of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Of course, Thorndike was more. Thorndike and Skinner are two names associated with operant conditioning, whereas Pavlov and Watson are really known for classical conditioning. Pavlov with his classical conditioning of dogs and salivation, Watson with his conditioning of little Albert to fear white rats in his study of stimulus generalization. Thorndike studied instrumental conditioning, and Skinner is also well known for the Skinner box and using that to study operant conditioning. So as research continued, we looked at prevalence, which is really a matter of understanding how acute or chronic a disorder is. Naturalistic observation was key in research. That would be studying something in its own environment without, or studying a group of individuals or an event in its natural environment without bothering that environment. A case study, study one individual that is highly exemplary of something we want to study. It may not be generalized easily, but it's very interesting, and perhaps we can learn a lot about, for instance, a serial killer. Think of Silence of the Lambs and Clarice meeting with Hannibal. She could have done a case study on him to learn more about serial killers. Could she generalize that to every sociopath and psychopath and antisocial personality disorder? No. But she could learn a whole lot about a very interesting case. Of course, with research, there's bias and generalizability that are issues, especially with naturalistic observation. One reason we don't get involved when we're doing naturalistic observation is because of our own bias. With a case study, as we just mentioned, not very generalizable because it's normally one person writing down what they think of, say, Hannibal Lecter, and that can be highly biased as well. There's also a lot of surveys. You may have taken some surveys. Sometimes there's a really obvious answer to a survey. Do you like to hurt little kids? The correct answer is no, right? And we all know that, but this is an example of self-report data, and there will be what's called presentation bias, where we want to look good. We don't want to look like a serial killer or a sicko. Or we may know that the experimenter is trying to study and prove some, X causes Y, and so we will help him or her. So we have questionnaires, interviews. Some of these are unreliable, and sort of the less structured they are, the more unreliable they can be. As scientists, even in psychology, we're very very careful in our research to to do things reliably, to do things in a scientific manner. So observational approaches were definitely something that we could say, well, look at that, I can prove that's going on. Whereas a lot of psychology does occur within the head, cannot be seen. What are you thinking? I cannot see it. That's difficult. Whereas if it's your heart rate or your number of steps you take, that's more behaviorist, and I can directly observe it. When doing research, we're going to have questions, hypotheses. We're going to be concerned with internal and external validity of our study and of the measures that we use to test people. We'll have a sample of people taken from a population. Normally our population may be, say I want to study teenagers. Well, who's going to be my sample? Well, hopefully a demographic representation, a representative sample of whoever I want to represent. So if there's 60% white people, 30% black people, and 20%, it can't happen. I'm getting my numbers messed up, but all right, let's go with 40, 30, 20, 10. 40. Yeah, I think that works. So 40% white people, 30% black people, 20% Hispanic or Latino, and 10% Asian, with about 0.1% maybe thrown in there for other. Asian Pacific Islanders, American natives, Alaskan natives, so forth. But the point is, with all those, we want to study all those. We want to study teenagers from the general population. Well, you can't reach all of them, so you need to find a sample, a representative sample. So maybe when you go to just high schools in Alabama, would you be able to get a sample that reflected the national sample? Probably not. You may have to contact some high schools in other areas of the country, things like that, in order to get a representative sample. So you can't reach all. Let's say there are, I'm just going to throw out a ridiculous number, which is, let's say there are 500 million teenagers in the U.S., and we want to generalize to all of them. Well, maybe we can only reach 2,000 or 5,000 would be amazing. But even reaching that number, if it's not representative, say it's all white kids and they're all 18 instead of ranging from 13 to 18, that restricts the amount that we can say about if the sample is not similar to the general population, and we can't generalize our results with the sample. We do research with the sample, ask them questions. We can't say that the general population are likely to answer the same way. With experiments, we get into criterion versus control groups, criterion being treatment versus control groups. And of course, we're going to, say we're trying out a new drug, we're going to give the new drug to the treatment group, and we're going to give a placebo or a sugar pill or something that has no true effect to the control group, or not give them anything at all. And we're going to study the differences that occur between the two groups to see what the drug does to one group while the other drug does nothing to the other group. I'm not going to get into that in great detail here. That's an experiment. Another way we often do research is through correlational research. This is a bit easier. We're able to get a lot of this data retrospectively. And we're able to get it through data banks, through, say, the National Institute of Health. We could study how just things that have been studied in the census, various questions that have been asked. And since we haven't done an experiment, we cannot make conclusions about causation, one thing causing the other. Rather, we have to say that two things are related to each other. Thus the name correlational. correlational research or correlational research. And there's going to be a positive or negative correlation. A positive correlation is like the more I run, the more endorphins my body releases. The longer I run, I can measure that. I can measure endorphin levels. I can see that they're positively related to each other. As one increases, the other increases. A negative correlation, or an inverse correlation, is the opposite. When one increases, the other decreases. The more I run, the less I weigh, right? So, normally, unless I'm building a lot of muscle. So that'd be an inverse or negative correlation. I need to point out retrospective versus prospective studies. Retrospective studies means asking people, when you were younger, did you drink a lot of alcohol and smoke marijuana? Did you do these sorts of things? That's a retrospective study in order to get information about now and say, well, you did this back then. Let's see where you are now. A prospective study is more of an experiment style, which is let's follow you. Let's see where you are now. You're a teenager smoking cigarettes. Let's see what happens to you in 20 years. With the experimental method, two key things that you need to know are independent variable and dependent variable. You need to know that the independent variable is the one that we measure. The independent variable is the one that we manipulate. The dependent variable is the one we measure. So let's go back to the drug experiment that I was talking about. Say I give you a drug. I may manipulate whether or not you get the drug. The presence of the drug is what I manipulate. That's the independent variable. The dependent variable is, let's say the drug is made for hyperactivity. The dependent variable then would be levels of hyperactive characteristics following the treatment. And I would want to see the treatment group versus the control group in order to measure the change of the treatment group when compared to the control group. Then I would want to, before that, I would want to establish a baseline of both groups and make sure they're equal. So I can measure exactly that they're actually changing equal amounts. I wouldn't want to accidentally get a control group that was already more hyperactive. Then I'm not measuring apples with apples, correct? You may want to become familiar with the ABAB design. Hopefully you've had experimental psychology. And this is just, a primer on some of the key terms that you need to start to become familiar with. Appreciate your time. Next video, we're going to look into causal factors and viewpoints in mental health. Thank you very much.